Okay, so this final talk of the workshop is titled, What is an American? I have been informed that that's a very important question that we all have to be talking about now. What is an American? And the original title for the talk was not that, but then I found out it's the question we all have to answer, so I figured I better answer it before they do. And the original title was The Foundations of American Liberty. So you can look at it either way. That was the intention that I had. But it actually answers the question, what is an American? It's people who believe in the foundations of American liberty. But I actually give an answer right from the start, which is Americans are citizens of the greatest, freest, most prosperous, and most righteous nation that has ever existed on the earth. That's what an American is. But the trick, there's always a trick. There's always a fly in the soup. Is I said that we're citizens of all these great things, most righteous nation. So we have to understand what is a nation also. I don't actually feel too strongly about having to answer the complicated question of what a nation is, but I want to let you know that there are other people thinking about this question and that I have thought about this question historically. So we'll start, as we started with another one of the talks, with one answer to what a nation is from our beloved Vice President.
You know, one of the things that you hear people say sometimes is that America is an idea. And to be clear, America was indeed founded on brilliant ideas like the rule of law and religious liberty, things written into the fabric of our Constitution and our nation. But America is not just an idea. It is a group of people with a shared history and a common future. It is, in short, a nation. Now, it is part of that tradition, of course, that we welcome newcomers. But when we allow newcomers into our American family, we allow them on our terms. That's the way we preserve the continuity of this project from 250 years past to hopefully 250 years in the future.
So there's an answer. It is people that have a common history and a common future. That's one answer. Another answer that was famously and consequentially given in 1913 by a man who named himself Joseph Stalin, not his real name. Stalin is kind of a phrase that means man of steel, as it turns out. He wrote a book in 1913 called Marxism and the National Question. And the entire first chapter of this long essay or short book, however you like to put it, is wrestling with the question, what is a nation? And here's what his answer was. A nation is a historically constituted, stable community of people formed on the basis of a common language, territory, economic life, and psychological makeup manifested in a common culture. And so what Stalin did with this idea was he birthed the program called Korenizatsiya in the early Soviet Union, in the 1920s in particular, and Korenizatsiya was the idea of pushing national self-determination on the minority nations bordering Russia as they were forming into the Soviet Union. The question was going to be if we want to build this giant international communist project, starting with the Soviet Union, an extended Russia, what do we do with, say, Georgians or Ukrainians? Now, Stalin, of course, was a Georgian, and Lenin had sent him to Vienna to study the question because the empire there, the Austrian Empire there, actually incorporated several different people groups that were working under one political banner, one state, but many nations. And they wanted to figure out how to do that. So he figures out this doctrine of national sovereignty, self-determination, and he used it to go around and tell the various minority nations that there was a great Russian chauvinism that would try to make them Russian, but that they had the right of national self-determination. So the feudal Russians under the Tsar wanted them all to have to act Russian, speak Russian, learn in Russian, conduct their business in Russian, to Russify them, as it were, and that the communists alone believed in their self-determination as Georgians or Ukrainians or Caucasians or whatever it happened to be. In other words, it was a propaganda technique to win their allegiance to the Soviets. which then went on to be a way for the Soviets to tell them that they were naturally more socialistic than the Russians, and therefore that their indigenous ways, korenizatsiya literally means indigenization, their indigenous ways needed to be preserved and elevated, and that the Communist Party would help them identify who the right leaders would be, elevate those leaders, and bring leaders to the National Congress in Moscow, where they would be able to have representation uniquely because of their identity. And of course, if anybody disagreed with those people, they would be accused, the person disagreeing them would be accused of a form of bigotry called Great Russian Chauvinism. You're like, wow, that sounds like DEI. It was. That's the DEI program. So Stalin was actually using this definition of nation to outline the program of what we now call DEI. Now, the fascists had definition of a nation that was a little bit more strict. I reiterate what I said earlier, though. Stalin, because of this focus in his work, was kind of mocked by many of the other communists in the Soviet Union as the National Socialist. For a period of time, apparently, I haven't double-checked the history on this, but the legend at least is that for a while, Lenin wouldn't even call him by his name. He would only call him the National Socialist or the Georgian, and would not refer to him by his name in order to kind of belittle him. Mussolini had another vision for a nation. Fascism, he says, is therefore opposed to that form of democracy which equates a nation to the majority, lowering it to the level of the largest number. But it is the purest form of democracy if the nation be considered as it should be from the point of view of quality rather than quantity. As an idea, the mightiest because the most ethical, the most coherent, the truest, expressing itself in a people as the conscience and will of the few, if not indeed of one. And ending to express itself in the conscience and the will of the mass, of the whole group, ethnically, it says ethnically, okay, ethnically molded by natural and historical conditions into a nation, advancing as one conscience and one will along the self-same line of development and spiritual formation, not a race, nor a geographically defined region, but a people, historically perpetuating itself, a multitude unified by an idea and imbued with the will to live, the will to power, self-consciousness, personality. Insofar as it is embodied in a state, this higher personality becomes a nation. It is not the nation which generates the state. That is an antiquated, naturalistic concept which afforded a basis for 19th century publicity in favor of national governments. Rather, it is the state which creates the nation, conferring volition and therefore real life on a people made aware of their moral unity. Kind of the key there is the state creates the nation, and the state is the will of the one, meaning the dictator, expressed through the many, which are the people. Hitler expressed roughly the same idea as this, though of course he had the ethnic component to this. He believed that the nation was a folk. It was a folkish nation, and it has an ethnic connotation to it. So when you hear Hitler reading or speaking, or you're looking at Mein Kampf, or you're listening to my podcast, and he talks about the German nation or Germany, he literally means an ethnic group. He means a race. So when he has statements like, that's when I definitively knew, and I was relieved to find out that the Jew is not a German, that's what he meant. When he talks about how it's like impossible for a Jew, in fact, to become a German, that's what he means. And that applies not just to Jewish people, but to other ethnic minorities that are not within the small list of ethnic groups that he thought were actually German. And when he says that the ambition of the German nation is to purify that race through various practices, they actually want to get down to the very small number of people groups that formed what he thought were the Aryan basis for the German people, and to start unmingling the blood that had already been mingled from the inferior races that had been allowed, in his own phrasing, to interbreed with Germans and thus pollute the German stock. He has a whole thing where he talks about how good it was that Germany, when it attempted to acquire Austria, failed, because that mix of nations that Stalin was studying would have been assimilated into the German body and thus would have polluted the race even further and made things even less tenable. But he also expressed the idea of the fascist concept of the state by saying, in fact, that the state is the being that makes the nation possible. So the state is a being that brings the nation into existence. So again, you have this idea of the state being that thing that makes the nation. It's not the people having a government for their own purposes. Here's what he had to say about the folkish issue. I mean, among a lot of things, actually. A state, he said, may be described as a model of its kind if it serves the vital needs of the race it represents, and if by its own existence the state actually keeps this national race alive. How this nation is viewed by the rest of the world does not matter. That is not a criterion for its success. It is not the task of the state to create abilities, but simply to clear the road for those abilities that already exist within its people. On the other hand, a state may be called bad, no matter how high its cultural level, if it condemns those who carry the cultural ability to destruction by allowing the corruption of its racial makeup. It's pretty serious. So it doesn't matter how good a state is in its practice, if it allows for the corruption of its racial makeup, you could call it a bad state. It's failed in its primary mission. And on the other hand, it doesn't matter how successful a state is, if it's got corrupted racial makeup, it's not a good state. Or the other way around, if it's not doing very well, but it purifies the race, it's actually a good state. So that's what he's saying there. The state in practice destroys the essential element needed for the survival of this culture. The state is not the culture is not the creation of the state, but is the fruit of a culture-building race protected by its unification as a state. Unfortunately, he laments, our German nationality no longer has a unified racial core, and the process of fusing the various original races has not progressed to a point where we can talk about the formation of a new race. On the contrary, the various poisonings of blood which have afflicted our political body, especially since the 30 Years' War, have rotted not only our blood but our national soul. So he's very serious that a nation is a race of people. He meant the blood and soil thing all the way. Now, it's a little unfair to drop a clip of a woke righty saying something, but let's play another clip.
The large amount of our government right now is just a wealth transfer between heritage Americans and the new political class that's being moved into rule society. That's just the dynamic we're seeing. And this happened in Rome. This has happened many, many times over. You can see many historical examples.
So the H-1B thing is just so the enemy is what you call heritage Americans. What are those?
Heritage Americans are those that are actually tied. You could find their last names in the Civil War registry. Like they have a tie to the history and to the land. And, Samuel Huntington is a guy who I really like. He wrote the Clash of Civilizations and Who Are We? And, I think won his debate with Francis Fukuyama pretty decisively. But, he said in Who Are We, his book about American identity, the core of American identity is the Anglo-Protestant spirit. And he's a man of the center left, as a Harvard professor. This is a guy who's not, he's not, you can only be an Anglo or a Protestant to be part of America. But he says even the Catholics and Jews in America take on this Anglo-Protestant affect in some way. And so you have to have this majority culture for people to assimilate to. And so when we're talking about a heritage American, we're either talking about someone who is tied specifically to that tradition or someone who has come here and has been here for generations, but understands that they are conforming to that way of being, that's the core of society.
And
So you did see that clip before. We played that. You're not going crazy. I'm not gaslighting you. The lights are definitely not getting dimmer. But I wanted to make the point that this heritage American concept is on that trajectory of something similar, that there's an authentic people that's hiding. So when J.D. Vance says, we're a people in a place, that's maybe fine, but then there are people that at least claim him as their own. I don't know if he is of them, but they claim him as their own, who are pushing this idea of a heritage American. And a heritage American is not a very clear concept, as you can hear. And in fact, we've heard this guy twice on what a heritage American means, but you can find lots of other definitions. Some of them say not the Civil War registry, but before World War II. What a surprise. Other ones say 3 generations. Other ones don't tie it to that. Some people say you have to be of a certain skin color and explain in much more plain terms why people of the wrong religions or wrong skin colors or wrong backgrounds or wrong immigration or whatever don't qualify. And of course, in general, this concept was something the Nazis embraced in a very extreme form, which is the Volksgemeinschaft, which is the idea of a national or folk community that's based around some authentic and proper definition of what it means to be part of that people. So we're talking a very broad spectrum here, and there's a friendlier end and a ugly, ugly end that Hitler described, and that's a problem. Now, I did have Mr. Aaron McIntyre, share that with us again. Let me make sure. I saw Mike put him on a slide and didn't put his name in quotes, and I snarled in the back of the room. He wrote an article the other day for The Blaze where he writes, he actually wrote it on his Substack, I think, originally, but it got published on The Blaze. And so if you'll go ahead and put up the slide, you can leave this up, if you will, while we do a lot of reading. So he wrote this article titled, "Paperwork Americans Are Not Your Countrymen." Now, a lot of you know I'm doing a podcast series called The Nazi Experiment, where I'm basically reading Mein Kampf to you, not in order, right? And so this phrasing, paperwork Americans, I was like, my goodness. I had kind of considered writing that as a hoax for somebody, because that is the characterization that Adolf Hitler gives in chapter 3 of the 2nd volume of Mein Kampf, which is the shortest chapter in the book, which is where he outlines what citizenship in the Nazi Reich means and how it will organize citizenship. So here's what Hitler has to say in that chapter. He's talking about birthright citizenship first. I'm not going to try to quote a ton of stuff from him, but he starts out by talking about birthright citizenship. He says, so that is one kind of naturalization by birth within an extended territory, and then there is another possibility for later naturalization by paperwork. The whole process of acquiring citizenship is pretty much like joining an automobile club. A person sends in his application, it is checked and approved, and one fine day he is informed on a slip of paper that he has become a citizen. This information is even put in a humorous and joking manner. The applicant, who was previously a Zulu or a Kafir, is notified, quote, "By these presented, you are now a German citizen. This magic trick is accomplished by the signature of a state official. What heaven could not attempt, one of these alchemical magician officials can do with the scribble of his hand. One scratch of the pen and a Mongolian is suddenly turned into a real German," and that is in quotes. No attention is paid to the race of these new, quote, citizens. So that's what Hitler says about paperwork Germans. What does Aaron McIntyre say in his article about paperwork Americans? Speaking of the Democratic representative in Congress, Delia Ramirez from Illinois, she is part of a growing class of politicians who treat their American citizenship as a formality. This is the woman who recently said she's a Guatemalan first and an American second, so this is the context of the article, and he has some point that she's expressed something that I agree is un-American. Many are first-generation immigrants, Mr. McIntyre writes. Ramirez isn't even that. She was born to an illegal immigrant mother who crossed the border while pregnant and secured birthright citizenship for her daughter. On paper, Ramirez is American. In every other way, she is not. That idea holds that America is defined not by shared heritage or culture, but by a set of abstract principles. According to this view, anyone who completes the paperwork and swears an oath is just as American as someone whose ancestors fought in the Revolutionary War. Paperwork Without Allegiance is the title of this section. Ramirez herself is not an immigrant. She was born under current understanding of the 14th Amendment. Her mother, in violation of U.S. law, crossed the border while pregnant. No agreement to any American proposition was required. Ramirez acquired the legal status of an American and the constitutional right to reject the nation that gave it to her. There is no ideological connection, cultural tie, or apparent love of country. Only the paperwork remains. So Hitler didn't like paperwork Germans. What was his solution to deal with paperwork Germans? Hitler says in chapter 3 of the 2nd volume of Mein Kampf, one becomes a state subject. So his classification system. The point of this chapter is to say there's going to be 3 classifications, not 2. It will not be citizens and aliens. There will be citizens, state subjects, or subjects of the state, and aliens. And if you are a subject of the state, you are a subject. You have no rights. Okay, so one becomes a state subject simply by being born in the state. State subject status does not entitle its possessor to hold public office or to be politically active, which is, of course, what R.N. McIntyre is complaining about. This woman is in Congress. That, of course, is a debate to be had about whatever you want to talk about, whether somebody who expresses that they don't hold their American citizenship primary, can that person serve in Congress or not? That's, I think, a question, but here is a different matter. So state subject status does not entitle its possessor to hold public office or to be politically active, such as participating in elections, either actively or passively, nor running for office or voting. The race and original nationality of every state subject must be proven. The state subject is free at any time to relinquish his subject status and become a citizen of whichever country is his own. So if you're not an actual German by race, you cannot be a citizen of the Nazi state. You are a subject with no rights. You can't vote. You can't participate politically. There's a lot more to having very few rights. You have basically the same rights with a tiny bit better than aliens who are there legally, like on a visa. And if you don't like that status, that's fine. The Nazi party and state will find out where you really are from and send you there. They will deport you. We'll get rid of them that way. So what's McIntyre's solution to the paperwork American problem? He says paperwork alone does not make someone American. The people exploiting our system understand this. They aren't confused. They're mocking us. And unless we find the courage to act, they will keep doing it. Send them back, every last one. This woman was born in the United States. Send them back where? Well, we can, I guess, assume that since she said she likes Guatemala and her mother was from Guatemala, that we must send her back to Guatemala. I don't know if Guatemala would accept this person who is an American citizen. This is the solution that's proposed. My alarm was, I've read this before. In fact, I read it last week. And I'm like, my goodness, paperwork Americans are not your countrymen. He's one of the ones telling us that the most, he said it on Tucker Carlson, he said it since. When Charlie Kirk tweeted it the other day, he quote tweeted Charlie Kirk and said it again. What is an American is the most important question of our age, is what he told Tucker Carlson. So we have to answer that question. Schmidt explains what we have with this paperwork American thing. He says, we are looking for a bond. This is in his legal basis for the total state. Of the total state. We are looking for a bond that is more reliable, more vibrant, and deeper than the deceptive bond to the perishable letters of 1,000 legal paragraphs. Where else could it lie but in ourselves and in our own nature? Here too, given the inseparable connection between the rule of law, the civil service, and judicial independence, all questions and answers lead to the requirement of a kind of sameness without which a totalitarian state cannot survive for a single day. So your totalitarian state can only work if there's a sense of sameness with all of your people, and maybe a shared sense of heritage, I don't know. So that's Carl Schmitt explaining what the National Socialist totalitarian state will require of citizenship in his essay, Legal Basis of the Total State. Now there is something to bring up here that's maybe, again, I don't know how fair this is, I'll just point something out. There's a coincidence in titling these things. It is not unknown that R.N. McIntyre is a Schmittian. He is openly a devotee of Carl Schmitt. He describes himself frequently as a Schmittian. He wrote a book in 2021 that came out, and he cites Carl Schmitt approvingly and explains his philosophy approvingly, agreeing 25 times in the text. It's not a very long book. That's not a gigantic number of times, but it's significant. The title of Carl Schmitt's essay that I just read from is The Legal Basis of the Total State. The title of R.N. McIntyre's book is The Total State. I don't think that he is unaware of what he's presenting, is what I'm suggesting, though I do not know. So I gave you these definitions not to impugn J.D. Vance. We'll just not mention R.N. McIntyre, or Stalin even. We can impugn Stalin all day, but that's pretty famously done. I actually just presented these different ideas of a nation so that I can say this: how is America different? How are we different? And there's a little sleight of language here, a little fast and loose, and we don't need the slide anymore unless you just want to stare at that for the rest of the time and hurt in your soul. And there are no more slides, so yay. How is America different? The sleight of language here is, you heard Vice President Vance say, or he was about to be vice president nominee. What do you call that person? He was going to run. He was going to be the candidate. That was at the RNC last year. So he articulated that, it's often said that America is an idea. You'll hear it from Aaron McIntyre. He actually talks in this essay that I just discussed a lot about how the idea is that America is a propositional nation, and that this makes a joke of that idea of a propositional nation because people who have no tie to the country whatsoever are free to reject the proposition, and we don't kick them out for it. That's his actual argument. Okay? And so here's the sleight of language. Is America an idea? No, it's a country. America is based on an idea. One idea. So America is the nation based on this radical idea that individual sovereignty and self-government are possible and can create prosperity. The idea that this works is called the American dream. So you could say that people who are citizens of this country, who believe in the American dream or have faith in the American dream, are Americans. They have to be citizens. And there is a covenant when you have faith. So there's an American covenant behind this, and this answers the question of liberty versus license. Are we free to do whatever we will? Are we duty-bound to do what we ought? Is it true that liberty means the freedom to do what we ought? That sounds like a funny way to phrase things. The American covenant is that if we want the blessings of liberty, it is our job to keep our end of the promise that we might be able to earn the blessings of liberty by believing in prosperity through self-government. That we believe in this, we do our part, which requires us to be personally responsible, self-governing individuals, and that if we do that, then we have some claim on the hope and that which is unseen that the blessings of liberty may land upon us. There's no promise that we're going to become rich. There's no promise that we're going to rise from lowest class to billionaire or millionaire or thousandaire or anything heir. There is that if we keep our end of the bargain, there is a promise that we keep in faith, the confidence in that which is not seen but has been promised. So I want this talk to be something like an Old Testament style prophet call back to the faith and covenant that defines what it means to be an American. That we may be able to secure for ourselves and our posterity, genetic and otherwise, the blessings of liberty promised by the American dream through keeping up our end of the deal. So now the technical part. What is an American? There are two questions here, legal and actually socio-spiritual. All that socio-gnostic stuff we've talked about all along is a socio-spiritual phenomenon. It's something like a spiritual question or a metaphysical question, but it's actually a social question in its primary form of expression. Legally, it's very simple, but obviously the arguments we're having means it's also somehow inadequate. An American is a citizen of the United States of America, and we have all these things that dictate what that means and how you become that, or how you are that birthright, or apparently naturalization through paperwork and the magical signature of a pen. It's a little harder than that in this country, by the way. Socio-spiritually, on a deeper level, an American is actually a citizen. It has to start there. It's not anybody who believes in this idea is American by default. And I do love when I see people in Hong Kong pressed by the Chinese Communist Party taking to the streets of Hong Kong, waving American flags in their defiance of the CCP. And I love when I see the same thing happen when all of this stuff went down over the last year in South Korea, and the South Koreans took to the street demanding freedom, waving the Korean flag with the American flag. They understand what this idea represents, that there is freedom, and that if they are given freedom, that they can behave responsibly, which is to keep up their end of the deal. And they understand that idea is represented by America and its flag. But if they're not citizens, they're not Americans. That's not a technicality. South Koreans are not Americans just because they wave the American flag and believe in freedom, and neither are people in Hong Kong. And that's okay. So socially, spiritually, an American is a citizen who upholds this belief in and upholds this covenant. That's what it means to be an American. You have to uphold the belief and you have to uphold the covenant. That's why we can have somebody here who's an American citizen, whose parents and grandparents and Uncle Bob and everybody else, my seventh cousin on up somewhere along the lines, Robert E. Lee, and they can say something stupid and we can say that's un-American. Even though they're as heritage American as you could possibly be. Who knows? They could be deep heritage Americans and find their names in the Civil War registry and fought in the Revolutionary War and every single thing, and they could be a post-liberal. Oh, you're socially, spiritually not an American because you stopped believing in the promise, you stopped believing in the covenant, and you're not keeping up your end of it. You want to upend it instead. It is un-American to be post-liberal in a fundamentally liberal country. So being an American is being a citizen who upholds belief in the American dream and participates in their end of the covenant, if we get in the deeper level of what it really means. Being a communist is un-American. So legally, technically, yes. Socio-spiritually, no. Notice there are two questions here, and that's why there's ambiguity and a space for bad actors to play. Just like how equality can mean equal before the law, and it can also mean equal outcomes. So there's room for the communists to come in and say that. Or equal in ability. I see a lot of people in this room that I'm absolutely positive just from first glance that are better at some things and worse at other things. That's totally okay. All men are created equal does not mean all men are created identically. It means we are all equal before the law. That's what it's actually referring to. So socio-spiritually, being an American means participating in and continuing the American tradition. That is a conservative, a Burkean conservative definition. There is a tradition in this country based on this idea, based on this covenant. And those who keep it and participate in it and uphold that tradition are behaving in an American way. And that is something of an obligation, although it's not required for citizenship. There are two levels upon which this conversation is being had. So is that Anglo-Protestant, as Samuel Huntington said it in his book, Who Are We? Well, yes and. We do have an awful lot of Anglo-Protestant in our background. Samuel Huntington's argument, I understand, having read a summary, I just found out about it when he said this like a couple of days ago, so I haven't read the book yet. But his argument appears to be pretty reasonable. It's controversial, but it's pretty well vetted. He's not a woke right lunatic. He did get in a lot of heat for this. He got accused, as you would expect, by his leftist colleagues of being a racist or whatever else, where that's not there. But that is largely the tradition, but not entirely the tradition. Largely and significantly the tradition that came to the New World as settlers to try and experiment in making a covenant with liberty. Nobody tell the woke right that the original heritage Americans were fleeing Europe because they wanted liberalism. That's what they were coming for. They were seeking religious liberty, probably first of all. They were seeking to get away from the arbitrary power of kings. And they brought that tradition with them, but along with them came other peoples too. There were other groups besides Anglo-Protestants. They were just the dominant group. And they had a bunch of different religions within the Christian faiths. There were also Jews, there were also other people, but not as many in number. And they interfaced with natives who believed different things and integrated and didn't integrate in different ways and in different amounts in different places. It was a bit of a mess from the beginning, and that's very American and it's very fine. But what they were committed to was an experiment in making a covenant with liberty, which they believed allowed them to pursue their covenant with God according to the dictates of their own conscience, their own reading of Scripture. It's a very Protestant thing there. To To read scripture for yourself was sort of what defined the Protestants. It was a capital crime in Europe at the time under the Vatican to have a vernacular copy of the Bible or to print one. So this was their mission. And why did they do it? In order to secure liberty's blessings specifically for themselves and their posterity, whether those people came from their fruits of their loins or on another boat, which a lot of people did for a very long time, including now, but most people use airplanes now. Their idea with liberty was particularly that this fused notion of the church state, the monarchical episcopate, will not interfere with their religion, their belief, their conscience any longer. It will not meddle in their affairs. It will not tell them what to do without due representation. Later on, the Revolutionary War was not fought over taxation, but taxation without representation is famously one of those issues that people raised. They wanted their voices to matter in their political affairs. So they wanted to be able to speak, and they wanted to be able to think, and they wanted to be able to believe, and they wanted to be able to argue and disagree and do what they could, so much so that they risked everything to cross an ocean. Have you seen the boats they cross the ocean on? Some of the boats are smaller than the waves. They are not very big boats. I don't know how much you've imagined what that would be like, eating whatever you're eating out of a barrel, hoping it hasn't rotted and that the boat gets there before it does. Knowing that you have no potable water available whatsoever besides what you packed on the ship, which was probably beer so it also wouldn't spoil. So they're all doing it drunk. Like, this is an amazing risk that they were taking. People were signing away indentured servitude 7 years of their lives as de facto slaves in order to have the opportunity just to get out of tyranny and try something somewhere else. And they were ready to do this at tremendous risk in an unknown land with hostile natives, with surprisingly deadly winters that they were not prepared for. Europe doesn't do winter like that except in the far north. Massachusetts is a little harder than England in the winter. Thanks to the Gulf Stream that, of course, climate change is all going to destroy, or whatever we're supposed to believe about that. So if we go against this covenant that these people risked everything for, if we even ignore this covenant, that's fundamentally un-American. It's socio-spiritually un-American, though it doesn't disqualify you from citizenship. It turns out this is one of the only countries in the world, as famously has been said, where you can tell the President of the United States, F you. And you are perfectly free to do so. You can not believe in the country, and you can make a critical theory. You can publish a book of lies called The People's History of the United States and let it be argued out whether or not it's true. It's a radical and courageous thing to do, because why would you take that risk to allow people to criticize the country you're forming? Because you believe that it's part of the covenant with liberty that greater blessings will come from taking that risk. Risk is the magic sauce in capitalism, by the way. It's one of what we call capitalism, free enterprise. The people who get rich do often have a good idea. They do often have luck, but they also take risk after risk after risk after risk and take on a lot more risk. If you own a lot of things, you're liable for a lot of things, and then that allows them to be able to multiply. That's actually the idea. And they were all the way in on this idea. So being against this covenant or refusing to participate in it in a socio-spiritual sense is un-American to the core. So if we ever created a new House Un-American Activities Committee, it's now called the House Judiciary Committee, doesn't quite do the same thing anymore, the test wouldn't be some arbitrary test of heritage. It would be to find out first, what is the citizenship? And if there were some test about un-American activities, whatever that might lead to under possible sedition acts, not saying these are good ideas, just saying if this was in principle something that were to come about, that the test would be, where are you with regard to the American dream? But it turns out you are perfectly free to reject it, making things complicated. This is bad news for the post-liberal, post-American movements who want you to be very positive about this in their very clearly defined way, even though the thing you're promising yourself to is no longer the thing that it was. So what are the components of this American vision that's supposed to bring us the visions, or the blessings, of liberty? What do they see? Why do they think that this could work? And there's a couple of major philosophical points that I'm not going to get deep into them at all, but I'm going to touch on them. And one of them we've talked about again and again already is realism. Americans are realists. There are some dreamers, there's everything else, we get that. But we are realists. We believe reality exists. Our idealism has to be eventually tempered by experience. How do you make a situation or a circumstance where that's the case? You don't give anybody anything for free or special. They have to prove themselves to other people by producing value for other people in order for them to test and see if what they're producing is worth anything. That's the idea. But the proposition of realism we already discussed is very simple. Reality is real and we can know something about it. That's all the philosophical machinery you import. Reality's out there. By the way, it does not matter if we live in a simulation, which I don't believe, or if we're brains in vats. The thing that we actually experience up against is real in terms of what everything else means in terms of realness. That's all it requires. We don't have to go all the way to the metaphysical foundations of turtles all the way down, or paperwork all the way down, or anything to get there. We just believe that reality is out there, it's objective to us, and that we can know something about it. And we come to know what we know under a realist position by checking against reality and applying our reason to what we see. This is where I was talking earlier about how truth can lay low the greatest charlatan or the greatest king or the greatest emperor or the greatest ruler as soon as somebody brings out a little old tape measure. I'm trying to not say something very rude. We could have a certain kind of measuring contest and it's all fun and games until someone brings a ruler, right? Doesn't matter how cool you think you are, that's the polite version. There's a ruler for this test. We check it against reality. Reality is objective to us. That's why it works. Nobody has special access to reality. Nobody has special access to the divine mind. They're not tapping in a Gnostic hermetic sense and getting a download from heaven. And if they do, they have to prove why we should listen to them for other reasons. I don't care if you think that God told you in a dream, in a voice in your heart, through a hairdryer, as Sam Harris famously mocked back in the day, that you should go on a quest. Do it if you want. But I don't have to join you and I don't have to believe that what you believe you heard is veridically what happened. We're going to have better tests than that in order for other people to buy the system. Because what we're going to consider real is that which is objective to us, what everybody has access to, and then it's not a matter of subjective perception or having to listen to a megalomaniac who's kind of lost his mind and it did get his message from God through his hairdryer that morning in his ear. In other words, reality is not a matter of construction. It's not a matter of imagination. Imagination is us picturing what we might be able to do within the constraints of reality to enhance our experience within it. It's something a little bit different. What this does, why this is worth having, why it's worth believing this, is because it puts us in a greater, though imperfect, alignment with truth. What does freedom have to do with this? If everybody's free to do this, somebody's free to bring the tape measure. And all of a sudden, the guy running his mouth might get laid low as a charlatan. So all of a sudden, everybody has to be checking against truth because anybody can check you against truth. You don't have some poobah who's telling you everything that you just have to believe. I'm sure that was a racial slur that I don't know about. So the result of this in practice is we all end up in greater, not perfect, alignment with truth. And when we align with truth, what we do is get right answers to questions. Well, why do we have questions in the first place? Because we're bored and we have soft hands and we sit around and read books and try to tell people what's in them? No, because we have problems. We all have problems. Those problems need solutions. The problems, by the way, are real. If you are hungry, you had better find a way to get food to your face. That is a problem. It might not be a problem for you because you know that food comes from the grocery store, but it is a fundamental problem in reality where the default state is abject poverty. All you have to do is become old enough to notice birds, and you'll know what I'm talking about. You start looking out the window, and you watch the birds in your yard or whatever flying around, and you realize they spend, for all their wild freedom, all their waking energy trying to find enough to eat, which they literally have to peck out of the ground with their face. Not the best experience. Not a lot of time for reading books about philosophy when you are a blue jay. Why would we want to align with truth anyway, though? Because like I told you previously, the truth is always going to win in the end. So the closer to truth we get, the better the answers to our questions, so thus the better the solutions to our problems. This has an important philosophical consequence that turns out to be reflected biblically in slightly different wording, is that we had better learn in a realist situation to love the truth. Why? Because if you love it, you pursue it, you protect it, you defend it, you articulate it, you proclaim it, you defend other people who are defending it, even when it's consequential to do so. You stand up for it because you love it and you know that it matters. But we also need to fear the truth. The commandment in the Bible is not to love God, it's to love and fear God. You see it again and again and again. Why had you better fear the truth? Well, if you have some wrong ideas, you're going to meet something called reality or the truth, and it will carry with it consequences that may not have fit into your grand design. Maybe you thought that, you took the right magic potion and you can jump off your roof and it's going to be awesome. And somewhere 20 feet below you is the truth. And it's going to break your legs. The truth will always correct you because it's the only thing it can do. You can only persist in error to certain degrees and mostly only in the social world. If you don't solve the problem of how to get food to your face and you decide, well, I'm now an ascetic and I don't need food, you're going to find out pretty quick that that's not the case. There was a famous influencer recently that had decided to live on fruit and fruit only for years, and she died of malnourishment, as it turns out, after many, many people told her she wasn't looking so good and wasn't looking so healthy. She thought she could live on fruit. She had this delusional belief about dietary needs of humans and that she had some spiritual belief about why fruit's a cleaner food or whatever, and malnourishment. In a glut of food. I watched this woman on a video one time came across my feed, drink a smoothie of something like 12 bananas at a time. It wasn't that she wasn't eating a nutritional profile that could sustain life. The truth will always lay low all error, and it will always humiliate everyone who is in error eventually. And the more pride and arrogance you have in that, the worse it will be. And you feel completely free to translate that into the religious language where we replace the word truth with God, say exactly the same thing, and now I'm giving a sermon in whatever church that is going to get protested for having me. But you might say, facts are facts, that's fine, data are data, notice the plural, data are data, but it's all about interpretation. And without interpretation of the facts, we don't have anything. So all is interpretation, right? Well, that's the subjectivist view. So is that inescapable? No. Turns out we can compare our interpretations. We can test those too. We can test the models that we produce. What I'm giving you, by the way, is not an explanation of the world. I'm giving you a model for how I think this woke socio-Gnosticism works and how it's evolved and how it developed. And that model can be checked for all kinds of properties. Is it mature? Does it answer questions? Does it have predictive capacity? All kinds of things. We can check our interpretations and see if they do better or worse. Not all interpretations are equal. The postmodernists got it completely wrong. But that leads us to a second principle that's fundamentally and deeply American, and that's common sense. Together, these were the philosophical core, besides the Anglo-Protestantism, I guess, culturally, of the American experiment. It's called Scottish common sense realism. That's why I said Americans are realists at heart. That's why I said that we believe in common sense. And I'm not going to refer to Thomas Paine here. He went a little nuts. I'm not going to talk about him or his pamphlet, Common Sense. That's not relevant. I'm going to talk about what common sense actually is. It's not stuff everybody kind of knows or should know. Oh, there ain't no common sense in it. Common sense these days isn't that common. It's not that. Common sense is just as common as it's always been. Common sense means that we all have sense perception and we all have sense-making abilities. We can perceive the world and we can reason about what we perceive, and it is common to everybody. This is the proposition that America was pursuing. This is why we were rejecting tyranny. Each of us has the ability to gauge the world around us, take in information about it, assess our problems, and make decisions to do something about them for ourselves. And we call that self-governance. We call that taking personal responsibility for the problems around us. That's actually a significant part of what actually makes us human. We have these two things in common. Every human has them. Every human who's, of course, healthy enough has the capacity to take in sense information about the world and process it through reason and other mental processes, including emotion. You can totally, as the phrase goes, chimp out, if you want to, about something instead of engaging it with reason. That's literally, we say, oh wow, that guy's acting like a chimpanzee, an animal, when people flip out instead. The fact is that we are not perfect instruments, but we can perceive the world with some degree of accuracy for each of ourselves. Therefore, we can perceive the world around us that's local to us without having to call in an expert to tell us what we see and what's happening. We have our own reason as a sense-making apparatus to do something with it. But here's the magic. We're social. We're not socialists. We're not a species being. We interact. So I can have something going on and I'm like, don't know what that is. And I can say, hey, Bob, come over here. What's this? And he can tell me what he thinks. And I can tell him what I think. Well, I don't know if it's that because I see this. Well, I don't know if it's that because it sounds funny. And we can start to compare the information that we're getting from our sense perception to get a better answer than either of us could have arrived at on our own. We can improve our answers to the world. Guess what? That only works when reality is objective to us, that it is outside of us. So that the thing I'm looking at is not a construct of my imagination, and the thing Bob's looking at is not a construct of his imagination, and we're just talking past each other from our subjective perspectives. No, the thing is there. If it's a tree, we can argue about how many leaves it has. Somebody can get the ruler. I'm sure Rain Man can show up and tell us exactly how many leaves are on it in 1 second. This is an amazing feature of our species. It's probably the most important thing we can do. We can compare our answers against each other's. But that only works if we're able to obtain different answers. And that requires us to have liberty. So the better answer to the question that's causing a problem in our life, do you think that's an alligator? The better answer that we can get, or is it just a log floating over there? The better answer that we can get to our question often involves us being able to compare our sense perceptions one to another. And what it results in is this weird thing that truth, at least about the physical world, moral truth is maybe a deeper question, spiritual truth is maybe a deeper question still, but about the physical world, about the things in front of us, and even about some ideas, is somehow that which is in correspondence to reality. Because if I'm looking at a thing and I get my understanding of it, and you look at a thing and you get an understanding of it, and we compare our understandings of it, and we can come away with a better understanding of it by sharing that information, it must be that we were perceiving the same thing external to both of us. And I say that's with two people, so maybe you say that's not that's perfectly true. Yeah, well, technically we could do this with all 8 billion of us. Every single person could weigh in on a thing if we had the time and resources to get them all mobilized to do it. The philosophy of science is a very well-developed opinion on how this works. This is why not all interpretations are the same, or are equal, I should say. Because we can look at things for ourselves with our common sense, compare our answers and get better answers, and thus we can believe that the reality that we perceive is actually real and that our answers are actually better, so we can have greater confidence in them. This is why faith is not an unreasonable proposition at any point. It is the reasonable confidence in that which has been promised but is not yet seen. If we think we can better understand the world around us, we can get better answers to our questions, we can get better solutions to our problems, and we can get prosperity out of that, which we call the blessings of liberty. But again, the key feature that makes common sense have a positive sum game in understanding the world around us is the liberty to disagree. If the emperor's new clothes are actually invisible and we all have to agree that they're glorious and nobody's allowed to say, maybe they're not there, then we're all living in a delusion that is not getting us right answers to the world, and eventually reality bats last. Somebody shows up with a measuring stick or something, and we're all humiliated. Now, being humiliated on a societal scale typically means a famine and 1 million or more people dying of starvation and exposure and disease that wasn't necessary. So how do we actually judge our models of reality besides just talking it out and comparing them? A little philosophy of science. I'm not going to go into the deep stuff at all, but there's actually a neat answer, and I think you'll be flattered that I'm going to cover it. We have to first believe something philosophical, that we can actually know something about knowing things. Well, the field of knowing things about knowing things is called epistemology. And there's actually a very strong model for how we can tell, or a very strong formulation, I should say, because I want to use the word model, I don't want to confuse it. It's a very strong formulation for how we can compare models that has been formulated by a friend of mine who I can only give you his code name because he's anonymous. He is on, you can hunt him down. The Christians will be appalled at his atheism, and that's fine, I don't care. And he did a lot of atheist stuff, and that's fine too, but he goes by the moniker King Crocoduck. He is a physicist and is fairly brilliant. And he put out something a couple of years ago arguing against social constructivism called the Big Four operational criteria for evaluating what we have in front of us, for basically grounding epistemology somewhere. And he says that we have these 4 criteria that allow us to know if our interpretations about the world are good. His argument is that if we don't bend to these things, we get worse answers. And if you're, say, in the jungle and you're trying to determine if that's a vine or a snake, you're probably going to die. So we became very good intuitively at this for social processes, and we became very perceptive and analytical for physical world processes because it increased our survival capacities. I know, Christians, the evolutionary part will end in a second. First of the 4 criteria is predictive accuracy and precision. Is what we have in our model applicable and faithful to navigating the world? In other words, is it just some imaginary fluff, or is it something reflecting the real world? A good model has to talk about reality, in other words. 2, explanatory efficiency. That's sometimes called parsimony. No extra moving parts. You guys have all seen a Rube Goldberg machine, right? So let's say that you want to get the orange juice poured in your cup, so they build this thing and a marble rolls down and it knocks down a bowling pin and it does a thing and it does a thing. 37 things. There's this game that was a Rube Goldberg machine game that a lot of kids played back when I was a kid called Mousetrap. So the whole point was to get a basket to drop on the mouse, but a marble would do this and a thing, and 84.6% of the time it didn't work. At least one of the pieces didn't work. But you got this really complicated machine to do this really simple thing. That's the idea of a Rube Goldberg machine. And I get it. The videos show up on my Instagram sometimes and I watch them like a little kid every time all the way through, like, wow. And it's always something really silly. Whatever it happens to be. That's not a good model. That's not a good machine. That's not a good way to solve the problem of getting the basket to drop on the mouse or getting your orange juice in your glass. Just pick it up and pour it. It's a much better answer. Why? Because it's much more efficient. So a good model, of course, is explanatory. It's not so practical, but it should have explanatory efficiency. Shouldn't have to add a lot of extra parts. There shouldn't be the what's it connected to the who's it to the thing to the other thing and the other thing and the banana and then this thing other. And that's why it made your disease go away, to rub, this dirt on your face. That's not a very efficient model. So that's a way we can judge if a model is good, that it's efficient. Does it apply to reality? Does it give an efficient explanation? Therefore, efficiency is a big deal if you have limited resources that you have to figure out how to allocate and share. Optimal flexibility is his 3rd criterion, which means there's accountability in the model and a willingness to revise assumptions if you identify contradictions. So you think it's a log and suddenly you realize it's an alligator and you better update your model of reality. So a good model for navigating reality has to have a mechanism for saying, whoops, we were wrong. We need to update what we're doing. And the 4th is the most challenging for a lot of people, rational coherence. This is all of these other parts where what happens in reality, and now the model actually has to be internally consistent and lack contradictions. Why? Why does a model describing reality, purporting to bring us truth, have to have no logical contradictions? Isn't logic something that's happening in our head? Isn't reason in the province of the mental and not of the physical? The reason is because reality is by definition coherent. Reality is never self-contradictory. We're leaving quantum mechanics out of the discussion. So if your model is not internally consistent and you find contradictions, you probably don't have a good model. All I've wanted to present this for is to say that there are very mature and sophisticated ways that we can assess whether or not the methodology is rigorous and likely to provide good answers to questions about the world. And then you can have your model and we can assess them according to not necessarily just these criteria, but criteria like these, and we can determine. And I guarantee you that the models that we're going to want to select to solve real world problems have a very simple thing. Notice how practical I'm saying Americans are here, by the way. We're a practical people. We're wanting to solve problems for ourselves and others. It's core to what we do, but the reason is because we live in reality. Reality is filled with problems and we want to solve them. So your model better reflect reality. It better have a correction mechanism if it's wrong. It better not have a lot of extra extraneous complicated pieces. It's not a complexity theory. It's actually what's the simplest explanation that will suffice is the better explanation. Not necessarily the fully right answer, but it's still a better explanation. Very practical. And then it has to be logically consistent because it actually matters. Good thing we have common sense and the ability to communicate, which requires liberty, which is why we have to believe in that and risk that he's going to say something wrong if I ask him what the thing is. Or if I say, well, what do you think I should do? He might give me bad advice. That's a risk. But the idea is that I can go get it. If he gives me bad advice or whatever, I can say I need a second opinion and I can ask somebody else. If that's the kind of question, or we can investigate this and say, well, I don't know. You did the experiment. Can I replicate the experiment? Maybe it replicated twice. Maybe should we check it a third time? Turns out statistics are really strong and we can find out when we need to check it a third time. I think that we should always be checking it at least one second time and maybe more. We should probably incentivize disconfirmation of claimed published material. We don't incentivize that. We incentivize the crap out of new results. We don't incentivize the crap out of saying, whoops, that guy screwed up or just might have made up the data. Should get like a medal in science for proving somebody wrong. That's actually the point of the process. We can also know a lot about this process of discussion, of comparing and contrasting. All this is what we have liberty to do. This also, by the way, requires believing we can know things, so there's a fundamental assumption on the table. And the best articulation I've seen for how this process goes, so I warned the Christians about the evolutionary part a minute ago. Now I have to warn everybody. The author of this has, and I know I apologize, John, you're not going to like it if you see it, has one of the more severe cases of TDS I've ever seen. And it does color some of the things that you read. You have to get past that to take out what actually I think is not tainted by politics. There's a certain irony to this. But the articulation is by a man named Jonathan Rauch. Jonathan Rauch wrote a book in 1992 called Kindly Inquisitors, which when I read this in like 2017 for the first time, I would have believed he wrote it yesterday using dated examples. He was explaining the woke in 1992 using 1992 examples and why the woke are wrong and how they do knowledge production. In other words, it's basically a leveling of the subjectivist postmodern view in favor of a common sense realist position. He elaborated on this in 2021, and that's where the TDS leads in the book, in a book called The Constitution of Knowledge. It is a pretty stunning, thorough expansion of that argument. And it's all based off of these two core principles, but then in the Constitution of Knowledge, he adds a third one. The two key principles in Kindly Inquisitors are that nobody has special authority, there are no arbitrary elites, and that nobody has final say. There's not, so-and-so said it, so the matter's settled. He's an expert. Fauci said it, it's done. Nope, everybody gets to ask questions. Nobody has special authority. Mr. Fauci was not the science and is not the science. And what he said was not law. It was all of our duties, in fact, to question that. All of us. And that's a great example of how consequential it is. So no special authority means that information is not to be judged as true simply because of its source. And I mean that in terms of humans. I will leave scriptural authority out of that, but that's of course within a set of religious beliefs. That's within a particular kind of community. I'm sorry. Oh, it's that we need a community that does this. Sorry, I forgot that there's a third principle for constitutional knowledge. Thank you. The third principle from constitutional knowledge is that this has to happen in a community setting. So the information that we deal with, that somebody gives, could be true, could be false, could be regarded as true, could be regarded as false, it doesn't matter. But nobody is a special authority. So the lowest of the low, the child in the emperor's new clothes, can challenge the emperor and his clothiers. You say, well, we know ad hominem is a fallacy, right? Well, it turns out ad hominem is not always a fallacy, so it's a little bit more complicated. If somebody's likely acting in bad faith or has direct conflicts of interest, there is a reason that you can go after the man. But the fact of the matter is you can't claim special authority that somebody is right, but you might claim special authority that somebody is wrong. Why? Because if, let's say, you have a conflict of interest, like you're giving your husband the contract to do all the stuff you're doing in your city council job, you have a conflict of interest, you might kind of fudge some stuff when you explain how it's all working. Well, we see this financial, so you have a conflict of interest here that you might be not telling the truth. Or you might be dealing with a subversive who's telling you, no, absolutely not, it's just going to be 15 days to slow the spread. Right? We just need, and Deborah Birx, didn't she come out and say that they used the 15 days this was our time to get 15 more days to convince Trump to do more, right? So that was bad faith acting. And it's our job to question. The other principle, like I said, is no final say. So every question can be revisited, no matter how annoying it is to keep revisiting it. New and additional information in particular coming to light forces us to revisit questions. Maybe we all conclude that there was some kind of Russia collusion in the 2016 election. Now new information has forced us to realize that it might have been with the other side. So the question's back on the table differently. This is the optimal flexibility criterion related to it. Nobody gets to say, story's over. We have to have a revision method. Like I said, the third principle is that this must take place in a community between people. There must be good faith actors with some probably bad faith actors that we're trying to detect and expose who are exchanging information for all of this to work. But all of our knowledge, because we are fallible, because we are limited, or if you're Christian, because we are fallen, I guess Jewish too, because we are fallen, is contingent and provisional and earned. It doesn't mean that we don't regard it as true. It means people have to prove what they're saying by saying, prove me wrong. Come find out. Come look for yourself. This, by the way, is why when I present my interpretations of a text, I read to you as much of the text as you can fit in a 4-hour podcast and then tell you to go read the book for yourself and see if I got it wrong. And then we can enter into this community, what he calls, I think, a little cringily, the reality-based community. But what he means is people who believe in realism, who can then compare and contrast answers against each other. And the bedrock that makes all this work is that reality is real. We have to have the realism for the common sense to get us anywhere. It's not subjective. The reality is external to us and the same for everybody. This principle in the sciences is called scientific universality. And this is how we approximate objectivity, even though each of us is locked in a subjective skull. I guess the skull is objective, but our mind is subjective for each of us. You don't know what it's like to be a butterfly or me. And I don't know what it's like to be a butterfly or you. I can make some certain inferences based on lots of commonalities of human beings about your experience or something, but I can't actually feel what it feels like to be you. Your CNS is your CNS, central nervous system, for the non-oncologists in the room. Scientific universality simply says that if the experiment is performed by different actors and it's finding a result, the result will be the same regardless of who the actors are. Reality is universal to all of us. It is in common to all of us. This is the bedrock principle of science that postmodernism rejects. They believe it's subjective, not objective. So who's doing the experiment, who's drawing the conclusion, fundamentally matters. This is called standpoint epistemology, that your standpoint, by virtue of your social position, bears, or your religious convictions or whatever else, bears on your ability to discern the truth. The feminists were arrogant enough to call this strong objectivity. Introducing bias to the objective process makes it more objective, as they put it. Sandra Harding, I think, called it strong objectivity. Now, Thomas Jefferson believed in this not just practically, but politically. The big question, or a big question at the founding of the United States, was whether or not America is susceptible to the takeover by a faction, which we might call a party or an ideology today. Could a faction gain in enthusiasm and power and effectively take over the country? Turns out the answer looks like maybe yes, unless we get back to our founding principles. What did Jefferson say, though, that would prevent this? He believed the answer was no, and we're testing his hypothesis right now. What was his answer? Why can we do this? If there's enough liberty, there will be enough contending factions to where each will check the others so that none has the capacity to be able to rise far enough to take over everything and become a tyrant. In other words, we need this reality-based community, if we call it that, as John Rauch did. We need this in order to, we have a group of people who start saying, this is the way, we figured out the secret of the world. They don't tell you they're socio-gnostic elitists or whatever, and we need another group that's saying, wrong. And all that they have to fight against you, because the truth levels all, is going to be a mob consensus mentality. And it is necessary for us to exercise our liberty, question assumptions, and engage in this process. This is our end of the responsibility act of keeping up the covenant. The reason that we're in a situation where factions are starting to take over, besides social media messing everything up, is because we aren't keeping up our end of the covenant. And what happens biblically if you don't keep your end of the covenant? The promises don't come in. You do your part, the promises, God will do His. You do your part to check faction against faction, and the blessings of liberty might be able to flow. Thomas Jefferson's answer was that if we have enough liberty, then factions can't take over. We are testing that hypothesis, as I said, and the way we're testing it is through the mass dissemination of the friend-enemy distinction. As much as we can say Carl Schmitt codified it in his book, The Concept of the Political, the year before he became a Nazi, as much as it was the basis for much of what was going on in the Nazi project, the fact of the matter is the communists were doing it first. The communists were, everybody who's with us are the people, and the people who don't agree with us are the enemies of the people. That's the friend-enemy distinction. The problem is that the friend-enemy distinction almost, not completely, almost necessitates doing the friend-enemy distinction back. If they're going to group up, that's what Hitler said, and push through a worldview, we have to group up and push through a worldview. If they have a political faith, Yoram Hazony said, we need a political faith to push back. Thomas Jefferson's answer was, no, you don't. You need skeptics who call BS, and you need lots of them. And the answer to the friend-enemy distinction, then, is not to play friend versus enemy. Remember, there are no political friends, so that's a trick. What's a political friend? What's the real word for that? Ally. We demand allyship. And the second you're not doing the right thing, you're not an ally anymore, and you're now an enemy of the people. That is a very contingent and dangerous place to be. The whole thing is a race-to-the-bottom conflict model of politics that only applies when things have already gone very sideways. In the stakeholder model, by the way, you have the complete rejection of this whole program. The shareholder model, common sense, right? If you want a share and you want a say, buy one. Get into the game. It's very simple. What is this all based on? The simple recognition, and I know the Christians are about to cringe a little and get comfortable, but I'm right. Underneath the American experiment is not that, are we this kind of Christian or that kind of Christian? Are we Christian or are we deist? Are we secular or are we religious? My goodness, are we actually a Jewish nation? And now I've missed it all along. I don't know. No, the answer is we are a nation of human beings. Therefore, we are not God. We cannot become God. everything American follows from the proposition that we are not God. Because we have to answer the question in any society of how authority or elite status is to be found, transferred, legitimized, authenticated, understood. There's one answer to the question of what gives authority or sovereignty. God alone. That's an answer. Another answer could be, I'm sovereign. Authority rests in me, and by extension, people who agree with and support me. There's this other answer, the American answer. Real authority, legitimate authority, does not lie in man intrinsically. We are all created equal. It may exist in God if he exists, but it's not in us. So it's not in you, and it's not in me, and it's not in people who happen to agree with me, and it's not in people who happen to agree with you. We're all in this equally before God, before the law, and in our common sense. Which means the American ethos is humility with regard to the question of political authority. If we have political authority, should we be elected to an office? Should we become a coach over people teaching them to do pole vault? If we should become a corporate leader, if we gain authority, then we have to earn it. And we can only keep it as long as we can demonstrate that we deserve to keep it by the people who voluntarily grant us that authority. If I want you to be my teacher, I have to consent to be taught by you, and you have to consent to teach me. So you had better have something I want to learn that you can demonstrate, and I had better have qualities you see as worthy of bestowing your time and your tradition into. We have to humble ourselves in order to get to this point. We don't deserve to be in charge over anybody else because we are not God. Whether you believe in God, whether you're a deist, or whether you're an atheist, doesn't matter to this formulation. Whatever that is, it's not us. So we don't have intrinsic authority. Therefore, because we're all equal, we have equal right to think, equal right to believe, equal right to speak, equal right to act. And that also requires us to be humble, or we might be humbled. We don't have to be humble, but somebody's coming with a tape measure sooner or later. Authority in the American answer, political authority or other authority, is that which we can demonstrate that we deserve to others who voluntarily consent to be in that arrangement. We become leaders when people assent to follow us, because we've demonstrated that we have something, and they only have to follow us for as long as they will. There are, of course, exceptions, complications in life. For example, if you decide to work at a company, you're consenting to that arrangement. If you decide to join the military, there's this chain of command, and you don't get to question that whatsoever. And you don't get to leave till you're done. So there's this temporary amount of time that you have to stay in, 4 years at a pop, and you don't get to negotiate that. Of course, there are exceptions for certain circumstances. But nobody in this program gets special authority, so everybody is just as humble as everybody else, and nobody has any final say. And this all rests on those beliefs in reality and in common sense, and that anyone, therefore, can be a challenger to any claim of authority at any time. By the power vested in me, can be challenged at any time. This gives us what we deem to be self-evident truths, believe it or not. There are certain things that our rights are inherent, that they are inalienable. Why? Because we certainly do deserve a right not to be deprived of life, not to be deprived of liberty, and not to be deprived of the property that we are able to bring into our possession. That's fundamental. Why? Because for us to be deprived of it, somebody has to have the authority to take it from us. Who has the authority? Should we quote Gandalf? Who has the authority to take your life? Nobody. Turns out not even you. Inalienable means inalienable. You don't get to alienate your own rights. Who has the right to lock you up? Only the state under the provisions of proven criminal guilt. Who has the right to deprive you of your property? Only the state under proven guilt. Only in that case. Otherwise, nobody can do that. Because none of us has the intrinsic authority, because that authority does not lie with man. That's where that idea comes from. How do we organize our powers of just government? It says from the consent of the governed. That's a complicated point. But we better limit powers so that nobody can get out of control. Carl Schmitt had this idea of dictatorship. He wrote a whole book about dictatorship. He says there's two kinds of dictators. There's a commissarial dictator who's a dictator, but he only has the power to make his decisions outside of the political order to restore the political order. Just think about how stupid that is for about 2 seconds. He decides he's going to step out of the political order. His only job, according to the political order, is to now restore the political order to solve some emergency state like COVID. And then he says, you know what? No. And you telling me that I have to come back to the constitutional order becomes what he called the exception. Therefore, I'm just going to continue. So the second type of dictator is the sovereign dictator. And the problem with Carl Schmitt's formulation of dictatorship and of political theology is that the sovereign having all the power, the executive, I should say, being able to unbind himself from the constitutional order, removes completely the checks and balances on his ability. There's no way to force him back into the constitutional order. And so what you end up with every time is a tyranny. And every time, let me just make very clear to you, a psychopath will run every totalitarian system eventually because they are more ruthless at playing the game, and that's who's going to win. Every single time. So we can either have divided powers with limited terms in representative democracy with authority conferred through the elections of the people, which is an authenticating process, the consent of the governed, for a period of time. Or we can decide to flirt around with a dictator who will eventually be a psychopath. The question of the benevolent ruler from Plato is really a stupid question. Oh, the best case scenario is a benevolent ruler. Okay, so how do you know he's going to be benevolent? Here's the truth. Whoever's ruling over you in a tyranny eventually will be a psychopath. It will not be benevolent. It might be benevolent at first, and it will not be eventually. And the answer will guaranteed be a character like a Mao or a Stalin or a Hitler. Eventually, maybe in one turn, maybe from the beginning. So we have a system of divided powers, checks and balances, and so on, in order to limit the authority of the various branches of governance at almost every level so that nobody can overstep their bounds. We have term limits, not in Congress, for the presidency and other things as George Washington installed, because we don't want kings. Because what we were rejecting was the monarchical model. We were rejecting the idea that the king and the nobility have inherent expert authority to rule over us. Joseph de Maistre and Carl Schmitt were wrong about the concept of political philosophy, at least according to what it means to be an American. The European conservative or counter-revolutionary, reactionary or fascist model is un-American. It does not believe in political equality. It does not believe in the fact that we are all created equal before the law. We have to specify that stupidly because they'll say, well, what about people who can run faster? Compare the Soviet model to this American divided powers. The Soviet was called, that's the Russian word for governing council, by the way. That's why we called them Soviets. Soviet is the Russian word for a stakeholder economy, as it turns out. There's a governing council of experts who are experts in communist theory, and they get to run everything. And how does it work? If you are in alignment with the Communist Party's theories and goals and activities, you're a person. And if you are not, you're an enemy of the state that the dictatorship of the proletariat is incorporated specifically to destroy. That's actually what Lenin says its primary job is to take care of enemies, internal and external. Mao said the same thing, that the people's government primary task is to destroy the enemies of the people and to make sure that only the people are treated as citizens. You might be a subject of the state otherwise, right? The fascist model is that the fascist state and its leader, the one we talked about earlier, are the only true expert authority to which our entire will has to be bound so we can realize our true potential as individuals through that. How is it determined who's in good standing with the fascist state? Agreeing with the fascist state. That's how. It's not each checking each, limited powers, divided powers. The fascist state gets to decide who's in line with the fascist state and make them people of power. That's it. The Nazi model worked the same way. It was called the Führer principle. The Führer had the power. The National Socialist Party, as his party in action, was the extension of that. It's the exact same model as the fascist model. And how is it determined whether or not you should be a leader in the National Socialist Party? Well, you're supposed to demonstrate leadership by being of service to the state. So alignment with the Nazi Party and the state. So in America, the idea is no. The party doesn't get to have intrinsic expert authority. People who agree with the leader are not right because they happen to think the emperor has clothes. And the stakeholder model betrays us in the same way, just to kind of close that loop. The stakeholder group has expert authority in the stakeholder economy. They're unelected, unaccountable experts who tell us how much water we're allowed to use in our shower every morning. They're telling us right now that the data centers are storing too many pictures because of your phone. And so if you have your phone backed up to the cloud, all those pictures that are saved in there are using too much data and they're wasting energy and water, so please delete your family photos. Those are things I've actually been seeing in the last couple of weeks. Because the governing council, the stakeholders decided that's what's necessary in order to make sure that we have enough energy for the data centers and not you. It's sustainable that way. In America, we believe then in individual sovereignty. The state exists to secure our rights from each other and from the state itself. That's a radical idea. The state is not going to rule. I invite you to listen to woke right people talk. Go to listen to their podcasts and see how often they use the word rule. See how often they call the people that we have in office not representatives but leaders. In America, the individual is sovereign. So let's talk about Carl Schmitt and his idea of sovereignty again in the American context, throwing out the Euro trash. In America, the individual is sovereign over his own life and his own affairs. The government has some roles: stability, peace, public order, national defense, national security, helping people resolve otherwise unresolvable disputes through the courts, and so on, establishing and enforcing the laws. These are all in our Constitution. It's inside my jacket. So Carl Schmitt about the sovereign says, the sovereign is he who decides on the exception. That's his first sentence of political philosophy. That's his definition of the sovereign. That means two things at once. One, when are we in a state of exception? When is the pandemic bad enough to suspend the Constitution? And two, what do you do about the exception? Is it 15 days or 2.5 years to slow the spread, which never slowed apparently? Schmitt locates all of that ability to do both of those things, decide we're in an exception and then what to do about it, and I just told you how it's contradictory, uniquely in the state executive, following the political theology views of Joseph de Maistre and his own kind of Hobbesian Leviathan views. Remember, he considers himself to be the 20th century Thomas Hobbes. He uses it specifically to justify the Führer principle and the legal basis of the total state, justifying the Nazi totalitarian state in 1933, as we've read from a few times. But in America, the individual is sovereign. So let's apply Carl Schmitt's definition. The sovereign is he who decides on the exception. That's you in America. You decide on the exception. If you have a problem and it's right in front of you, you get to act to solve it. You don't have to go call a committee. You don't have to get a permit. If you decide you want to build a structure on your property, you can just go ahead and do that to a degree. There are some civil codes. And if you do something wrong, you might be held to account for it. But you have the ability to go ahead and solve your problems. What do you get out of the ability to solve your own problems? To decide, you know what, there's an emergency in my life. Here's an example of deciding an exception. My family member right now is having a heart attack and I need to get to the hospital. There's a speed limit sign right there that says I have to go 30 miles an hour. I think I'm going to go faster. was being told a story by another family, and nobody in my family is having a heart attack right now, I hope. But I was being told by a family member the other day a story of them speeding over something to get somewhere faster, mostly because maybe reckless driving, I don't know. And they got pulled over by a state trooper, and the state trooper comes up, knocks on the window goes down, and the state trooper's first question to the person driving was, is somebody having a medical emergency? It wasn't, do you know how fast you're going or something smartass? Is somebody having a medical emergency? And the answer to that question would have completely changed what happened next. If the answer was yes, you might end up with a police escort for your safety at high speed to the hospital. You might end up with the police officer taking the sick or injured person into their care and custody and driving at extremely high speed with good training to the hospital or something of this kind. You would have been facilitated. You probably would not, even though you are legally liable for breaking the speed limit, you probably would not be held to it. But if you said no, then the state trooper might get a little snarky with you and you might walk away with a citation. You have the capacity to decide on the exception in your life, and the responsibility part can come later. It can get resolved in the courts. You can be given a citation that you then have to deal with. And then it can go to court and you can say, officer, I was speeding because XYZ, or sorry, judge, your honor, I was speeding because XYZ. And they have the power of decision to decide whether your violation of the law was acceptable or reasonable or not. We used to have this thing in law, the postmodernists destroyed it, called the reasonable person standard. What would a reasonable person do in this circumstance? Somebody with common sense realism. And that could get you out of having broken a statute or a citation or a violation for breaking a statute. If you have a problem, we get to solve it, and then we can deal with the consequences, and it's our responsibility to do that if we do. If you engage in civil disobedience because you think it's the exception that the law is unjust or evil, and you refuse to participate with that law, maybe you refuse to pay a tax for something you don't agree with, whatever it happens to be, and you get arrested, maybe you're in contempt of Congress, and you get arrested, you suck it up and go to jail for 4 months. And you don't complain about it, and you don't make a hay about it, and you don't cry about it, because you've taken the responsibility. What this allows when the individual is sovereign is for us to foster our own responsibility, sense of responsibility, independence, and our own capacity to consider that which is in front of us, and that decisionism moves down the chain to the most local places that it could be. Remember the idea in distributism, when it's not being enforced by some crackpot stakeholder model, is that the furthest ends of the chain have the ability to deal with, the economic issues that they're dealing with? You actually achieve the aspiration of that by giving people the power to make their own decisions. This is how you unlock the blessings of liberty. The rule of law becomes the decision process above you if you have erred. And we all agree to the objective standards of law and to be held to consequence for them if we decide to violate. And then how does that happen? You actually have to injure somebody. You have, if I am making a noise violation because I'm having a party and that's the exception, and my neighbors don't call anybody and they don't complain, then nothing happens. But if some rando on the internet 3 states away calls, they don't have actually any standing because they're not an injured party, technically. And so you can resolve your own issues amongst each other and bring the state in to resolve problems as rarely as possible, only when it's necessary. So we're distributing decisionism rather than locating it in a central authority that is unbound and therefore uncheckable, who will become a dictator, who will eventually be superseded by a psychopath. Carl Schmitt's model is really bad, and it's horrifying. Not just because he was a Nazi, that we have a massive contingent of right-wing thinkers thinking this is the political theory that America has been missing. America was established to reject thinking like Carl Schmitt's. It is un-American. This principle of individual sovereignty is part and parcel with another principle, that is limited government. The government should be as small as possible and no smaller. It should actually exist to secure a very small number of things that individuals literally cannot do for themselves, and to secure our rights as kind of a arbiter of last resort. That's why we grant them a monopoly of force. This limited government principle is actually the foundation of prosperity, wealth, and abundance. And I want to explain that. That is, the blessings of liberty come from having a limited government situation. Not growing the state or seizing the corrupt apparatuses of the state and giving it a new ideology, like we started the conference with, again from the current vice president, before he was vice president. The promise of the American idea for those who keep its covenant are the blessings of liberty. But that's a matter of faith. And faith without works is dead. So we actually have to do the work. Well, when do we do the work? We're a lazy people. Some percentage of us are bizarrely industrious, and we hate those people. In the friendly hate way, we actually appreciate them, but we know there are these superstars out there, always doing the right thing. We're generally lazy. This is actually a good principle. Laziness is a good principle. It's the efficiency principle in action. Don't waste energy. It's hard to get the calories in your face. Don't waste them. So Charlie Munger, like him or not, he was Warren Buffett's investment partner, knew a thing or two about some stuff. Smart guy. Show me the incentive, he once said, and I will show you the outcome. It's all about these incentives, and limited government arranges the incentives for prosperity, liberty, and abundance. And I'll make the case for you. You are first party to your problems. The government is third party to your problems. Your friend or your mom might be second party to your problems. If you have a problem, you'll solve it. All the 90s kids are happy. Local problems are local, so local solutions are likely to be the most informed, the most urgent, and the most pressing. There is a bigger incentive locally to solve a problem. If your toilet is overflowing, do you want to have to file a piece of paperwork with City Hall for them to come and fix that? No, you do not. You want to figure out where the plunger is and solve the problem yourself without somebody knocking on the door and saying the 9 scariest words in the English language. Hi, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. The thing is, my problem is my problem, so I am motivated to solve my problem. If you care about me as a second party, you might be motivated to solve my problem. If we rely on the state to solve our problem, it's not that important to them. They have a lot of other people with a lot of other problems. It's not their problem. They might be contractually obligated to get around to it. So my problem is my priority. So my incentives that the state does not have are as follows. I want it solved. I want my problem solved. So I have to take responsibility for the problem in front of me to find a solution for it. I'm going to solve my problems rather than let them fester. I want it solved now or as soon as possible. So I'm going to seek an efficient solution to my problem rather than sitting around or building a Rube Goldberg machine to unplug my toilet. I'm going to take the quickest available route that I can come up with, maybe with the help of a consultant or a friend, to solve my problem. So we're going to get something called efficiency being incentivized. I want responsibility is incentivized, efficiency is incentivized. I want my problem solved as cheaply as possible. I work hard for what I have. I don't want to spend $2,000 unplugging my toilet. I really hope that's not what happened with the Taco Bell. I want to solve this problem as cheaply as I can. So economy in solution is incentivized. The cheapest available route to a workable solution, but it's still got to be a good enough solution because I actually want the problem solved. And I want it solved well if possible. I would love to come up with a good solution. So on top of those other incentives, we also incentivize ingenuity, innovation, and quality in action. And I especially don't want to have to sit around waiting for some third party in a state of dependency. I would rather be independent so that I can solve my own problem. That incentivizes an internal locus of control, a can-do attitude, and more ingenuity. If I don't know how to solve my problem, I'm motivated to figure out how to solve my problem. I'm on the YouTube figuring out how to clean a mass airflow sensor by myself so I don't have to pay $180 to get somebody to squirt a little cleaner in there that you can buy for $6 at the auto parts store. Just got to figure out how to unscrew that thing to get it out of the thing so I can spray the stuff. Don't break the platinum wire, don't do it, and then put it back in without blowing anything up. That's all I want to do. If you can add a profit motive to this problem-solving set of incentives, boy, have you unlocked something there. Why? Because people are people and problems show up a lot in the same ways. A lot of times you have the same problem I have or had. Hey, I have a solution to that problem, and for $39.95, I can tell you how to solve your problem. Ooh, you can make $39.95 telling people how to solve the problem. What if I could tell 100 people how to solve this problem? Somebody can do the math. That's $39.95. Like $4,000. What if I could tell 1 million people how to solve that problem? What if I could get 1 billion people? What if I could get 4 billion people? And you could charge $1,000 per solution. You're like, what kind of problem would have a solution like that? 4 billion people using a $1,000 object, carrying it around in their pocket. And whoops, it breaks every 6 months. You dropped it, didn't you? That's expensive. Somebody pushed you in the pool. That was funny in the 90s, but not anymore. The profit motive becomes an incentives multiplier. It incentivizes people to take risks, big risks, that bring massive innovation, massive problem solving. The solutions to my problems can scale, and I'm incentivized to scale them. Solving my problem's great. Solving the same problem just as easily for 200 people makes me a lot of money. Or 2 million people makes me a 3 comma person. Let that one spin in your brain for a minute. 3 commas. Billion. And these can scale to huge, huge statures. It also, when we have a profit motive attached, incentivizes producing surpluses, but not ridiculous surpluses. If I make hammers, I might need a hammer. I might want a backup hammer. So I make 2 hammers and I stop making hammers. But if I figure out I'm good at making hammers and everybody else around me might want hammers and I can make them while they do other things that they would rather do than make a hammer that maybe they don't know how to make or don't want to bother with, and I can sell the hammers for $20 a piece, and I have 200 friends, I think, wow, I could make 200 hammers. Or I could maybe make 400 hammers, but if I made 4,000 hammers, I'm probably going to end up with a closet full of hammers that I don't want, and I'm going to be saddled with them, and I wasted a lot of material costs. So it incentivizes us to produce excess, but not ridiculous excess. In fact, in the aggregate, the exact right amount of excess. That has a name. Prosperity and abundance. Limited government unlocks all of the incentives a people need to generate prosperity and abundance. And we don't just do it a little bit, we do it really well. Economies of scale come into play. If I figure out how to make 1 hammer, it takes a lot of resources, but you can actually copycat a lot of stuff, and you can make 10 hammers cheaper per hammer than you can make 1 hammer per hammer. The per part's very important there. That means you can unlock actual expertise, the things that you're good at. In economics, we call that the law of comparative advantage. So we get to tap a fundamental economic law, which leads to the optimal, not ideal, allocation of talent and resources. So we end up with abundance, which are reasonable surpluses, but not more. Prosperity follows from abundance. That creates wealth, which is the stored capacity to solve problems for self and others, and to move those solutions from one person to another through the process of profitable trade, which is incentivized through the profit motive. We can actually expect to get a reasonable return on that which we put in, our so-called just desserts. You know what the word for that is biblically? When you get what you deserve back out of a system when you put something into it? Equity, without the communist perversion of the word. And this emphasizes a correspondence to truth in that realism and common sense. Underwrite it, because what it actually means to solve a problem is to find an unknown truth that has value. This is how you unplug your toilet. That is a truth that you might not have known before. And it matters because it solves a problem. Whoever is solving problems better can win. Capitalism is a truth engine, or free enterprise. I'm trying to avoid the trap of using the word capitalism. The problem with government, like I said, it's a third party. It lacks all these incentives to do any of these things well. Maybe it can do them. It cannot do them well. Why? Because it's not incentivized to do them well. There is no incentive. There is no king who's so invested in his entire population that he's going to go around and figure out how to solve everybody's problems really well. That's too much for any one person or bureaucracy to do at all. This is a structural problem with letting government be the solver of problems. And Americans have understood this from the beginning. The goal has always been to get government as out of the way as possible, which is not to say all the way out of the way. Anarchy doesn't work either. With the government, independence is replaced by dependency. You have an external locus of control. You have to call some office. They aren't going to help. They're going to direct you to another one. You get a whole process, and then they'll show up when they're ready. 3-4 days, who knows, 3-4 months, who knows. Well, there's a lot of other people. Whoops, we forgot. The paperwork, we keyed it in from your phone call, but we pushed the wrong button, and now we never got to you. And whoops, you got that 4S thing on your flights now, and you're not going to have a good time anymore. Ingenuity and innovation collapse. The government has no incentive structure to innovate, no incentive structure to be ingenious. It only comes around and solves the problem just barely good enough to get it out of its way, to check it off of its docket if it has to do them. They give formulaic, bad fit solutions to problems because without the profit motive, and the public sector by definition doesn't have one, they don't have an incentive to come up with an ingenious solution or even a good solution. Efficiency and economy become matters of policy, not incentive. Therefore, they are weak. They might have a policy that we will answer you in a timely manner, but they're probably not going to be able to. In terms of economy, they're going to give contracts to their brother because humans are fallen creatures and we're selfish and we're pretty crappy sometimes. So there's a hotbed of graft and corruption that comes in. Equity becomes impossible. There are no just desserts from the government. There are none. So equity becomes this forced distribution or redistribution of resources. Governments don't create wealth, they redistribute wealth that somebody else created. And because every system is leaky, you eventually run out of everybody else's money. It turns out that these systems are imperfect. All systems are imperfect. So what you end up with outsourcing things to the government are zero-sum and negative-sum situations due to waste, fraud, inefficiency, etc., rather than a positive sum that you get from profit motive. You get a socialist drain on the system, which is a motivation killer. You don't even have people wanting to go do the stuff that gets things done to earn the taxes to pay the taxes. They'd rather pay less taxes. They don't want the crappy government solution anyway. Justice goes right out the window after these, so now we don't have truth and we don't have a lot of justice. This is a very susceptible object to communist subversion. And when you get communist subversion, you might get reaction. So extremism can come down the pike. And without the profit motive, you can't multiply. You can't even get any of these incentives. So the profit motive is the generator of productivity. That's why the solution that every communist state stumbled upon to solve the problem of productivity when everybody started starving was to allow people to make profit. Every single time. Let people do their own thing and make a little money, and we'll ease the famine. And then we can clamp back down later. Profit motive is the generator of productivity because it encourages reasonable surpluses. These problems of incentives are intrinsic, they're structural, they plague all centralization models. These are the problems that collapsed the Soviet and communist systems. These are the problems that would have collapsed fascist systems if they didn't get so out of control with their attempt to take over the world that we had to go stop them with military force. These are the problems that in the authoritarian semi-fascist state in Spain ended up turning Franco's Spanish miracle into, something a little bit less than a miracle by the 1970s. Stakeholderism is not going to be able to escape these intrinsic structural problems of third-party lack of incentives for solving problems. The American experiment solves them all. Because I said the other day, they get the idea of an economy upside down. They believe that the economy is something that serves people. The economy is not something that serves people. The economy, I hate to use the word, is emergent. The economy is all of the economic activity, productive and trade activity that arises from a people playing in a set of base rules. The only thing the government can do is tweak the rules. The economy cannot be the handmaiden of the state. All they can do is modify or interfere with the incentive structures for people to for people to solve their own problems, either for good reasons like securing property or for bad reasons like trying to manage people's problems for them or create security that doesn't need to exist, like income security or something like that. It is sometimes, like I said, necessary for the state to intervene, but you incur trade-offs. This is not an ideal system. Economic statism, like in the stakeholder model, always runs a trade-off against the fruits of a free economy. You're going to have a centralization, you're going to undercut these incentives, so you are going to have control at the cost of independence, innovation, responsibility, efficiency, economy, and actual equity for other ends, which can include security, but usually mean control over what people can do, and what people can say, and what people can believe. And the worse it gets, the more you have to clamp down so that nobody notices that it's going wrong, and they blame the wrong people, frequently the Jews. This is all based off of the fundamental property that is opposite of DEI, which is called exclusion. Private property is private because of a doctrine called the fundamental right of exclusion. So when we say that you have an intrinsic right to life, liberty, and property, we mean you have an intrinsic life to not lose your life, not have your life taken, not have your liberty taken, and to exclude people from your private property. This is my house, get out. You always have that right. And the foundation of American prosperity of wealth rests on this principle as well. It's not just in government non-interference, it's deeper than this. It's in our secured right to private property. So Americans believe in private property and their securing, which does take some just government to achieve, because there are bad people out there. Bad hombres, I think, was the word you're not supposed to use for them back in the day. This doctrine, the fundamental right to exclude, is exactly the thing that's under attack by the doctrine of inclusion. Inclusive capitalism means not exclusive free enterprise, but this fundamental belief that my property is mine and it is not yours, and your property is yours and it is not mine, from which we get individualism, by the way. If you can have yours and I can have mine, we must not be the same. We must be different things. This is the fundamental property from which everything else flows. All wealth creation actually comes from this. Why? Because we can each have our property and set the terms upon which we will part with it. So if I have some property you want, you can't take it from me by force. You have to find a way to negotiate with me to get me to give it to you. And if you have some property I want in exchange, I can't make you give it to me or any more or less of it. You have to consent to give it. So if I have a hammer and you want a hammer and you say, man, I want the hammer, and I say I want $500, you can say no. The price list is on the menu for a reason. Not in the hotel all the time. If you've been to the bar. But you should be able to weigh out the cost and the potential value. What happens then is when you and I agree to exchange something, you leave perceiving you got more value, and so do I. That might be ephemeral value, like a feel-good, or like it was my brother, so I had to, family bonds. It turns out capitalism doesn't dissolve family bonds intrinsically. It actually allows you to navigate, are you going to cut your brother a deal? Because you get to set. When you hear capitalism, by the way, in the communist literature, capitalism destroys the family, remember what they actually mean. Capitalism is a means of production according to the theory, so is feudalism, so is slavery. What they mean is all of them are based on the concept of private property. So what they say is the idea of having private property destroys the family. No, it doesn't. It secures the family. This is a straight inversion of the truth. They're fundamentally and absolutely wrong. And when we decide to exchange, we both leave with a perception of higher value. And if it's strict monetary transactional exchange, which is totally fine, especially between strangers who don't have any intrinsic sentiment between one another, which you have in any large society, you leave with more value, I leave with more of your money, we're both happy. If what you have is more valuable than when we started and what I have is more valuable than when I started, guess what happens? There's more value. And if there's more value, there's wealth. That's what wealth is. What does it mean in practical terms? If I have a hammer and you need a nail driven in, I've helped you allocate the resource. We've agreed to allocate the resource somewhere that it can solve a problem. It's all very practical. It's all very real. This isn't airy-fairy economic theory. Wealth is the accrual of value, which is the accrued potential to solve problems for self, others, and society. And when we are actively looking for ways to solve those problems, we are generating the foundation of wealth. And when we can exchange it and both believe we came out richer for having done it, then we are generating wealth. That's literally where wealth comes from. And we produce those surpluses because we're incentivized to do so by the profit motive in the positive sum game this produces. All ships can rise. So I'm incentivized to do all of those things I just told you about efficiency, economy, responsibility, blah, 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 even better, because I can decide how much of my stuff to give you for what of your stuff, on each of us being happy with the terms. And profit becomes maximized when we are all efficient and we are all economical in our production. So I'm supposed to figure out how to make my hammers better and cheaper and faster and distribute them better and get them to where the problems are, where people will actually buy them, where there's a market for them. I'm incentivized to solve those problems without having to care about those problems. I don't care why you need a hammer in California. I just know that you're going to give me $20 if I can get you one. So all of a sudden, you don't have to give a crap about other people's problems to want to help them solve their problems. That's a big deal. This is high tech. And if you do really well at this, you might get to hear, "Well done, my good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a few things, and now you can be master over Apple." You can have a giant corporation for having done very well with helping other people solve problems that you might not even care about because you don't even know them. This all comes from securing the right to private property, which is the fundamental right to exclude, and the profit motive. There's your solution, commies, to the problem of production. Let people make money. Whoops, it's not communism anymore. And the results you get are going to be abundance, surplus, wealth, prosperity. It just takes freedom. It only works this way every time. Just not equally for everybody, because not everybody produces equal value all the time. But there's a deeper reason that Americans care about securing our rights to life, liberty, and private property or exclusion. It's because we're not God. None of us is. In other words, these secured rights protect our souls if they exist, or whatever that means. And that's what these totalitarians are actually after. Mussolini said it over and over again. It's a spiritual program in fascism. Your right to life means they can't kill you. Your right to liberty means they can't jail you without due cause, obviously, and due process of law. Your right to property is they can't alienate you from the fruits of your own efforts and talents. Again, all subject to legal processes and due processes of law. What does that have to do with your soul? Well, if they can deprive you of any of those, they can compel you. And if they can compel you, they can compel what you believe, how you act. They can get you to take up actions you think are immoral. They can make you believe things that you know are untrue or are unholy or that are evil. They can get you to act in accordance with those beliefs. So they can control your spiritual life. They can compel you. And maybe they're presenting that you have to believe these certain things and they have the right faith and their values in God, but maybe they have the wrong ones. But it's not on you anymore. They're the ones choosing that we're all going to worship sustainability and inclusion. We're all going to worship the folk community that we're all supposed to fit into as heritage Americans. In other words, they can fundamentally transform who you are by compelling you repeatedly to compromise yourself, which has a slang phrase, selling your soul. Every time you lie to fit in, you sell a piece of your soul. You compromise some of who you are. You compromise some of your fundamental dignity to God, and the American experiment was set up to say, no, you will not do this. An American is somebody who believes that the state in particular, but none of our fellows, has the intrinsic right to do that to any of us, to get us to compromise our most sacred and important capacities, including the capacity to solve our own problems at need. Therefore, if you are religious, when you have these rights unsecured, somebody can come along and interfere with your covenant with God if He exists. That's a big deal. So if we were founded as a country by religious people who fundamentally, truly believed in Christianity, they understood that that was a big deal. And the Congregationalists in Massachusetts had absolutely no standing to tell the Danbury Baptists how they had to do things. Because what if they're wrong? But we have a different faith too in America. That faith in the blessings of liberty, the American dream. And they can screw with that covenant too if they can deprive you of these things. And we live under tyranny, not freedom, in that case. How do Americans, good Americans, respond to these threats? To ourselves and our souls, even when they're made in the name of our own good or the greater good or the common good. I want to read to you a little bit from my state constitution, the Tennessee State Constitution, which was written and verified's the wrong word. Ratified, thank you. It's been a long conference. In 1796, Article 1, Section 3 of the Tennessee State Constitution says that all men have a natural and indefeasible right to worship Almighty God according to the dictates of their own conscience, that no man can of right be compelled to attend, erect, or support any place of worship, or to maintain any minister against his consent, that no human authority can, in any case whatsoever, control or interfere with the rights of conscience, and that no preference shall ever be given by law to any religious establishment or mode of worship. Based. And what do we do? What would we say if they attempt to make us compromise anyway? This is what the state of Tennessee, which filed the first lawsuit against the COVID policies anywhere in the country, a group in Tennessee did, not the state itself. They sued the state. Under the state constitution, this is the clause, the article that they invoked. If they try to force us, this is the American answer to that. Article 1, Section 2, the immediately previous article in the Tennessee State Constitution reads that government being instituted for the common benefit, not the common good, the doctrine of non-resistance against arbitrary power and oppression is absurd, slavish, and destructive of the good and happiness of mankind. 15 days to slow the spread was arbitrary power. They did not have the authority to do it, and immediately a group in Tennessee sued. That's the American answer to tyranny. This is slavish, absurd, and destructive of the good and happiness of mankind, and you won't do it. That is, Americans reject tyranny. That is what an American is. An American is someone who rejects tyranny. So let's give the answer to the question and close the conference. What is an American? An American is a citizen of the United States of America. Spiritually, an American also holds the foundational American belief that self-government is possible and opens the door to greater prosperity for each of us. It doesn't guarantee it, it opens the door to it. An American, therefore, has faith in the American dream, thus articulated, and keeps his or her end of the covenant that it entails. And that makes it more than a dream. It makes it a promise. And he uses his American liberty to pursue the dream and the blessings of liberty that are held out in promise for the faithful and responsible citizens who will sacrifice to obtain them. Your participation is necessary. Faith without works is dead. You can't believe in the American dream and get rich. You've got to work for it too. An American is a classical liberal in all the regards presented here, who will fight and die if necessary to protect his God-given right to hold this faith in liberty, to keep this covenant and pursue this dream, the dream of the promised returns of the blessings of liberty, his just deserts, equity in the biblical sense, and to do so against any post-liberal interference from left or right. Thus, the Americans are the citizens of the greatest, freest, most prosperous, and most righteous nation that has ever existed on the earth. What is an American? Americans are a faithful people with regard to the blessings of liberty. But we recognize that it is a covenant that we must uphold and participate in. So we are responsible and we are practical. And just as we see in the Old Testament book of Numbers, when we wander in the desert and things are not going so well, and we have been given miracle after miracle from the blessings of liberty so far, and we doubt and lose our faith and wish to go back to the slavery and captivity of Egypt so we can have our cucumbers, then we also forfeit those blessings of liberty and shall not be permitted to enter into the promised land. It is not for us if we are faithless and if we are actionless and if we are irresponsible. Americans are people who understand this and live this. This is my call back to faith in America. Thank you.